The catchy media headlines, hordes of reporters hoping to catch a newsworthy moment on camera, family members eager to have justice, two sides defending their cases, and all the shenanigans of a court trial all come down to a few words known as the sentence. It is these words that will determine the fate of the accused. You could hear a pin drop as the judge read the sentence, and in this video, I will show you how these 9 Mafia members reacted to one of the harshest sentences: life in prison. John Gotti, the jail-defying boss of the Gambino family, was finally starring at the end of his era. To think that he had been ratted out by one of his own, a cliche by all accounts, must have been a painful experience. Notwithstanding, Gotti was confident that he would win in the end. After the judge had read out his sentence, declaring that Gotti would be spending the rest of his life in prison, the 51-year-old mob boss smiled and shook his head in silence when the judge asked if he had anything to say. But Gotti had something to say, however. It wasn't meant for the judge, but for his closest ally, co-defendant and partner in crime, Frank Lashio. As if to reassure his friend, Gotti tapped Lashio on the shoulder and told him, "We have just begun to fight." According to his lawyer, Gotti's mood was dignified, strong, and resolute. But the mob boss had reasons to be confident. After all, he had successfully evaded conviction twice, earning him the nickname the Teflon Don. But this time it was going to stick because one of his trusted underbosses had switched sides and was spilling the beans. Sammy the Bull Gravano was the mob hitman, so you better believe he knew where the bodies were buried. And when he reached out to the deputy U.S. attorney saying that he wanted to meet, John Gleason knew that he had an ace that could help him put Gotti away for good if he played his cards well. Gleason had previously lost a case against the Dapper Don, as some called Gotti, and he wasn't about to do that again. But nothing prepared him for how far Gravano was willing to cooperate with the government. According to Gleason, when he met with Gravano, the former mob underboss went straight to the point, saying, "I want to jump from our government to your government." But why would Gravano switch sides on his boss? Well, during the pre-trial hearings, FBI recordings had been played in the court, and according to Gravano, it sounded as if Gotti was giving out orders to have the former hitman killed. Gravano also revealed to the prosecutors that should they win the case, Gotti would likely have him killed, and to prevent that, he would have to make the first move and kill Gotti, his brothers, and even his kid. With Gravano as a key witness, Gotti was eventually convicted, ending his cat-and-mouse game with the law. Outside the courtroom, a crowd of about 1,000 people had gathered in protest. The demonstrators, perhaps incited by the Gambino family, destroyed several cars and injured about 8 police officers. But this time, the prosecutors had successfully nailed Gotti with the help of Gravano. The Dapper Don, known for his flashy dress style and expensive suits, was finally going to be styling with orange jumpsuits for the rest of his life. Frank Lashio. Lashio was defiant, but maybe he was just drawing strength from his friend and boss, John Gotti, who was regarded as the most flamboyant crime boss ever. After the judge read his sentence, Lashio decided to break the post-sentence silence with what I would call the most loyal statement, considering that his life as he knew it was over. First, he began by telling the court that he was innocent, and then he said he was guilty, but not guilty of the crimes he was accused of. According to Lashio, his only crime was being a friend of John Gotti. "I am guilty, though. I am guilty of being a good friend of John Gotti, and if there were more men like John Gotti on this earth, we would have a better country." For most people who knew what Lashio and his boss had done as the leaders of the Gambino crime family, his statement might be laughable, but the crowd that had gathered outside the courtroom chanting their support for the heads of the crime family almost made it look as if 2 innocent men were on trial. But this could easily be a plot by the Gambino family with a long history of crime in New York. Lashio had joined the family as a bookmaker and loan shark, a very important position in the Mafia family because he is directly responsible for shaking down anyone who is indebted to the family and making sure all debts are paid. Soon he was promoted to head a branch of the Gambino family in the Bronx, New York, taking on the name of Caporegime. From Caporegime, Lashio was again promoted to the position of underboss after the previous underboss went to prison. He was later made the consigliere. In layman's terms, he was the right-hand man of the boss, the king's whisperer, if you may. He had the ears of the boss, a position that was only accorded to an individual who was trusted. With that position, it didn't come as a surprise that Lashio was facing similar charges as his boss: racketeering, murder, conspiracy to commit murder, gambling, obstruction of justice, and tax fraud. He was sentenced to life in prison, but that is not where his story ends. While in prison, the friendship between Lashio and his boss was strained after the two had a falling out. The incident involved the former hitman who had turned on the boss, Sammy the Bull Gravano. According to the story, Lashio had shared oranges with his friend and boss Gotti and the mob snitch Gravano. Sharing an orange with a snitch might have been what triggered his former boss, who belittled Lashio before other inmates. Infuriated and humiliated, Lashio, who once swore loyalty to Gotti, now vowed to get him killed. Lashio planned with Sammy to kill the boss, but then Sammy spilled their little secret in his book titled Underboss. When Gotti heard what his closest ally was planning, he put a hit on his former consigliere. However, neither Lashio nor Gotti was able to carry out their plans of killing each other. Lashio remained in prison until he finally died in October 2021 from multiple medical complications. Joey Lombardo. Lombardo showed up in court sitting in a wheelchair. Whether this was one of his antics or he was actually sick is not known. Whatever it was, it didn't matter to the judge who handed him a sentence of life in prison. However, Lombardo remained unshaken, telling the court that he was innocent of the charges for which he was convicted. "Now, I suppose the court is going to send me to a life in prison for something I did not do," Lombardo said. He also said that he was sorry for the family of the victims, but that he had no hand in the murder. The family of his victims had a different story to tell. To them, Lombardo was a killer who took away their father and husband, Danny Seifert. Danny and Lombardo were close friends, but according to investigators, that friendship turned sour after Lombardo found out that Danny was talking to the FBI. Before the incident, Lombardo had conned his way into the Seiferts' home to take advantage of Danny's business to launder money. Aside from wielding a terrifying reputation as a ruthless killer for the Chicago outfits, Lombardo also had an unusual charisma that helped him get along easily with others. He earned the nickname The Clown for his theatrics, like when he covered his face with a newspaper while leaving the court. He also had highly evolved people skills, a natural ability to disarm people, street smarts, and a goofy charm, according to the FBI, so it wasn't so difficult for him to get close to the Seifert family, so much so that they were considered close friends. They even named one of their sons Joey, after the mob boss. However, this was just business for Lombardo, as he would soon prove to Danny and the FBI who had really underestimated him. When the Seiferts realized they were in bed with the devil, it was already too late. Danny had been tapped to be a key witness against Lombardo, and when word of it got out, a hit was placed on Danny. He was hunted down by several men and shot right in front of his wife and son, 2 days before he was to testify in court. His youngest son, who ironically had been named after Lombardo, recalls seeing some men chase his father like a pack of hungry animals, and it made him feel like a coward for not seeking revenge. Danny's murder was one Lombardo could not escape from, and although he pleaded innocence, the judge was not buying it. After listening to him, the judge told Lombardo, "The worst things you have done are terrible, and I see no regret in you." Many years later, Lombardo still insisted he was innocent and continued to seek ways to appeal his sentence. He also wrote several letters in which he complained about his failing health and the poor treatment within the facility where he was incarcerated. He ended his letter by reaffirming the fact that he was innocent, saying, "As I sit in this wheelchair, I am positively not guilty of all charges in the indictment. I repeat again, I am positively not guilty of all charges in the indictment. I rest my case, Judge." Madonna Matthew. At 84, Madonna was not in his prime, and after serving consecutive prison sentences, he must have been getting ready to put his mob days behind him. But he soon realized that the law has a long memory, and it doesn't forgive. Madonna, who was already serving a 5-year sentence, stood before the judge pleading his innocence as he was sentenced to life in prison. He said, "I am innocent. I had absolutely nothing to do with the tragic death of Michael Meldish. I conspired with no one. He and 2 other members of the Lucchese crime family, one of the 5 families of New York organized crime, had plotted and executed the death of Michael Meldish, who was the leader of the East Harlem Purple Gang. Michael and Madonna were once allies until it was time to repay a debt. For some reason, Michael refused to pay the $100,000 that had been loaned to him, and rather than approach his ally with a good reason, Michael told Madonna to f*** off. From one crime boss to another, Michael must have known that telling Madonna to f*** off was a death sentence. Perhaps he was hoping that as a friend, Madonna would be lenient, or at least he wouldn't take it to heart. But he had misjudged or belittled his ally. Because the Lucchese family boss wasn't going to let it slide, he immediately put a hit on his former ally with the help of his close friends, Londonio and Cadwell. Londonia drove the unsuspecting Michael to a location where Cadwell was waiting to finish him off. After the job was done, Michael's body was spotted by a woman who drove by thinking the driver was drunk. When she got closer to investigate, she noticed that the driver wasn't drunk, he was dead. Although Madonna denied having a hand in the death of his former ally, there is no way he can prove he didn't give the order, being that at the time, he was head of the Lucchese family. Cadwell and Londonio wouldn't act on their own. Also, Madonna might look stricken with age, but make no mistake, he didn't become a boss by a stroke of loss. He paid his dues. Madonna became affiliated with the Lucchese family as a reward for keeping silent after a grand jury had summoned him and demanded insights into drug activities in the New York area. At the time, Madonna was serving a 30-year prison sentence for drug trafficking. No doubt he had some names, but Madonna was no snitch. Because he chose to keep silent even after being promised immunity, the judge added an additional 528 days to his sentence. But Madonna's silence paid off, and he was given a place in one of New York's leading crime families. He was soon promoted to the position of capo and then inducted into the ruling panel of the family. From there, he rose to the rank of acting boss. But unlike many other crime bosses who usually spend the later years of their life in prison, Madonna has been in and out of the system so many times that he must have been counting the days days until he was finally free. However, his past caught up to him, and the aging crime boss's hope of ever stepping out of prison was dashed in pieces. Frank Calabrese Sr. I wouldn't say Frankie's reaction to his sentence of life in prison was that of shock or remorse. I could say he had regrets, but it's definitely not for the crimes he had committed. His regret was much more personal. It was born of betrayal as he listened to his son testify against him and the organization.
When he was killing, he wanted to make sure you were dead. So he'd love to strangle you and then cut your throat from ear to ear.
At some point, Frankie is said to have whispered something to his lawyer, then smiled, smirked, and shook his head as his son drove the metaphorical knife deeper and deeper into his heart, with words that would definitely send his father away for life. Frankie was a made man, a term that is used to refer to a fully inducted member of the Mafia. He understood the do's and don'ts of the organization. He even enforced them. One of the rules of the organization was a code of silence and honor, the Oath of Omerta, an oath that is taken by every inducted member of the organization. Perhaps Frankie had high hopes that one day his son would take his place in the organization. Little did he know that Junior, as his son was often called, had plans of his own. Junior had decided to cooperate with the government and spill out every secret of the organization he had been loyal to for most of his life, not because he didn't know that it was against the outfit's code and could literally lead to death, nor is it because he didn't understand that loyalty to the outfit family comes before anything else, even God. In his testimony, the progeny of the crime boss had mentioned that he once swore to take revenge should his father and uncle be killed. So he clearly knew what he was doing. The question is, despite knowing this, why did Junior flip slides? It is because while serving time in prison for loan sharking, Junior came to one conclusion: there was no way out. According to his testimony, it is clear that this was something he had discussed with his father. Junior had wanted Frankie to stop what he was doing and take a step back from the activities of the organization. But when it became clear that his father was a mafia through and through, and that Frankie had no plans to retire or step back, Junior decided to turn a snitch. In a way, this was his best decision, being that, unlike his father, who had been fully inducted into the organization, there is no mention that Junior had taken any oath, nor had he been sworn in just yet. If that's the case, then he was only actively involved in the Mafia because his father was a leader, and Junior had become unwittingly entangled with the organization, and he didn't have many options. According to Frankie's lawyer, his client and son didn't get along so well. Snitching was Junior's way out, and of course Frankie wouldn't approve. But what choice did the boy have? Junior didn't spare any detail as he went on and on talking about the organization's protocols, secret code names and all. He knew everything, and he was not afraid to reveal it all in the court. This is why I said Frankie had regrets, but not because of his crimes, nor the fact that he would be spending the rest of his life in prison. His son's testimony was more than enough to put the crime boss away for good, and like his attorney rightly said, it's very difficult for any parent to see his child testify against him. Anthony Zotola. Anthony bursted into tears in the courtroom, whether that was from the regret of having his father killed or because he would be spending the rest of his life in prison. Nobody really knows, but his tears did little to stop the judge from sending him to prison for the rest of his life. He subjected his family to a reign of terror. I see greed and money as one of the core reasons why this heinous crime was committed, the judge said. Anthony Zotola had murdered his father, Sylvester Zotola, aka Sally Daz. The Zotola family was associated with the Bonanno crime family, one of New York's 5 major crime families. Daz ran illegal gambling machines and used the money he made to invest in real estate. Soon, Daz had created a real estate empire said to be worth millions of dollars. He employed his 2 sons, Salvador and Anthony, to help him manage the business. Anthony's job was to maintain the properties, collect rent, and manage a subsidiary company he co-owned with his brother. But Anthony was not satisfied with what he got. He wanted it all. In his greed, Anthony decided to get his father and brother out of the way so that he could take over the family business. The son of a mobster definitely knew his way around the world of crime, and finding a few hitmen to go along with his plan was not a problem. However, Daz managed to escape his son's hitmen 6 times within a year, not knowing who was after his life or why. He lived in constant fear for his life. At one time, the assassins got to him in his house, beat him up, and stabbed him several times before slashing his throat. Daz managed to survive the attack. Another time, the gunman shot him in the head, chest, and hand. Again, Daz survived. Even a cat has only 9 lives. Eventually, the hitmen got him in front of a McDonald's restaurant while he waited to pick up his coffee. After the hit, Anthony received a text from the hitman saying, "Can we party today or tomorrow?" To which Anthony replied, "I have the cases of water in a day or so." A photograph alleged to be the payment of $200,000 was later recovered from a phone belonging to the hitman. His brother, possibly overwhelmed by the fact that Anthony had been behind the hit placed on his life and that of their father, kept asking Anthony why he had done such a thing. "Why? Anthony, my brother, why? What did you do? Dad gave you everything. What you did to me and Dad is unimaginable." Anthony had torn his family apart, and for that, he got a life sentence plus 112 years for weapons charges. Willem Haler. Haler didn't get to be called Netherlands' most notorious gangster for no reason. Although he refused to give a statement in court by himself, his lawyers spoke on his behalf, and Haler's words clearly show he had no remorse for the crimes he had been convicted of. In fact, he claimed he was innocent. In the statement read out by his lawyer, Haler blamed the unprecedented media campaign against him, which had been instigated by his sisters with the help of a journalist. It seems the gangster would have preferred the trial to be conducted with little or no media frenzy, and I see how this could be of benefit to him. It is all about his image, and a strong media voice speaking up against him will not paint a positive picture of the gangster. This is why, after receiving the life sentence, Haler proclaimed he was right all along, saying, "I am not guilty of ordering assassinations and there is no evidence for it, and yet I have been convicted. I can draw no other conclusion than that I was right all along." Nicknamed the Nose, Haler had a long history of crime, beginning with the kidnapping of beer magnate Freddie Heineken in the 1980s. But what finally ended his reign of terror was the murder of 5 of his criminal associates, including his brother-in-law. Perhaps this was what motivated his sisters to turn against the merciless crime boss and secretly record his conversations, which eventually sealed his fate after a lengthy 18 months trial. According to his lawyers, the evidence against Haler did not directly tie him to the crimes he was accused of. This defense argument would likely be considered for any ordinary criminal, but for Haler, it wasn't a question of whether he carried out the assassinations himself or not, but the fact that he was merciless and indifferent in his belief that he had the power of life and death. Because of this, the judge decided that a life sentence was appropriate. The public's reaction was as expected. The courtroom was filled with screams and applause as the sentence was passed, and Haler led out of the courtroom. His sisters, on the other hand, were not in a celebratory mood. You would think that they would be happy their gangster brother was locked up, but maybe they were more worried for their lives, knowing that Haler would seek revenge and come after them. Astrid, who had made the recording, had to quit her career as a defense lawyer and live in safe houses wearing heavy disguises. According to her, Haler wants her dead, and she doesn't blame him. She goes on to say she really feels like a Judas and that she betrayed him, but something had to be done to stop him. Carmine Perso, the boss of the Colombo crime family, Carmine Perso, aka the Snake, decided he was in the best position to represent himself in the court. And yes, he did put on a great show that left the court in stitches, but he couldn't stop the judge from giving him a sentence of 139 years in prison without the possibility of parole. Before handing down his sentence, the judge reckoned of Persico's intelligence, saying, "Mr. Persico, you're a tragedy. You are one of the most intelligent people I have ever seen." And he was kidding. Persico may not have been a lawyer, but he had a reputation for being incredibly smart and tough. He was a fighter, and perhaps this is why he rose so fast to become the youngest crime boss of one of New York's families, the Colombo family. His journey started at a very early age after he dropped out of school to form a street gang at the age of 16. By the time he was 17, Persico had already built a reputation for himself as someone who wasn't supposed to be trifled with after beating up a young man to death in a street fight. For some reason, Persico was never convicted of murder, and the charges were dropped. Because of this, the Mafia became interested in the teen, and he was later recruited by a capo in the Colombo family, first as a bookmaker and loan shark before he was later promoted to burglaries and hijacking. He soon rose within the ranks of the Mafia to assume the position of capo. From capo, Persico took over the Colombo family after a tumultuous battle during which he earned the nickname Snake because he had switched sides and even attempted to murder the leader of a faction that was planning to overthrow the boss of the Colombo family. A police officer had walked into the bar just in time to see Persico attempting to strangle a man with a rope. Persico fled the scene, and he was never charged because nobody would talk, not even the man who was about to die. By the time he turned 40, Persico was already the boss of the Colombo family, but the price for his sudden ascension within the Mafia organization came at the cost of his freedom. Persico spent most of his life locked up in prison, but while this would be the end for many other mob bosses, being locked up did not stop Persico from running the family. It is believed that he ordered most of his successful hits while he was in prison. After his theatrical attempt to prove himself innocent failed, and he received a sentence that is in all accounts equivalent to a death sentence, Persico did not retire from his position as boss. He continued to lead the organization until his death at the age of 85 years. This made him the longest reigning mob boss in history. Thomas Peta, notorious mobster hitman Peta, made a show in court after he was given a life sentence. He smiled at the reporters and gave them a thumbs up. That is not the reaction you'd expect from a man who would be locked up in a cage for the rest of his life. But for Peta, this was a win, because he was facing the death penalty and only managed to escape it after his lawyer convinced the jury not to consider capital punishment, on grounds that most of the murders for which Peta was convicted took place before the death penalty law was passed. Peta was standing trial for over 60 murders, but before he got his fearsome reputation as a homicidal murderer, Peta was a victim of bullying, mainly because of his high-pitched voice. It is widely believed that this must have caused him to be insecure and fueled his passion to become good at karate in order to defend himself. In a space of 2 years, Peta transformed himself by training under a renowned Japanese martial artist. He even grew his hair to emulate famous martial artist Bruce Lee. He read books on war and fighting and developed a good understanding and appreciation appreciation of Japanese culture because of his skills. Peta became known as Tommy Karate after he ventured into the world of organized crime. But his skill was not the only thing he had picked up in Japan. Peta's training did nothing to guide him on the right path, however. It might have taught him another lesson. So many times you see convicted criminals plead they are not guilty when sentenced, despite the mountain of evidence that says otherwise. But not Peta, who never claimed he wasn't guilty, and when a fellow mobster turned informant began to plead for a reduced sentence after being given 10 years in prison for 5 murders, Peta was offended. According to Peta, if you're really sorry for killing 5 people, you take your punishment like a man. In other words, actions have consequences. Perhaps this was why Peta was not remorseful when he was sentenced. He was fully aware of the consequences of his actions. And speaking of actions, Peta was the worst of his kind. Not only was he very meticulous about the way he killed, but his extensive knowledge of how to dispose of the bodies made him less of a hitman and more of a serial killer. It is said that he had special kits for dismembering his victims. He would then bury them in plastic bags or suitcases deep enough to go undetected by police dogs. After that, Peta would keep a souvenir, like a piece of jewelry that belonged to his victim. It is no wonder he was facing the death sentence. His crimes were so cruel and gruesome, and just before handing down his sentence, the judge said, "Nobody deserves to die as these people died." At last, justice prevailed, but no punishment can make up for the lives ruined by these men. If you liked this video, click the cards on your screen to see more videos like this.